Some parents in Boston Public Schools are trying to have a say over budget plans for the next year. It's expected there will be an increase in money from the city, but the group Smart BPS wants to see more of the money committed to programs at individual schools. Our guest is one of the group's parent leaders, Jane Miller. Thank you very much for being with us, Jane.
Sure.
As you point out on the Start Smart webpage here on Facebook, is that, there are two things that don't make sense right away. Is that the city's putting more money into the school budget, but parents see more programs that are either being cut or that they're worried about. Well, talk about that.
Right, so the budget is the biggest budget ever, which you would expect because costs increase, and we're not arguing that. But what we're seeing is that most of the budget goes to central office. It doesn't actually go to the schools. If you look at the last 3 years' budgets, each year the schools' increase hasn't even been 1%. So the programs at the schools are being cut, even though we're putting more money into BPS.
Now, when you say money goes to central office, it sounds like it's only being spent on bureaucrats who sit at the desk all day, but couldn't some of that money be cycled back to the kids or even maybe account for transportation expenses?
Absolutely. A significant amount of money, in fairness, does go back to the kids one way or another. Central office pays for nurses, they pay for special education, they do pay for transportation costs, but we don't really see the transparency in that. We don't know why it has to go to one place before it ends up at another place, and $600 million doesn't equate to that.
Talk about the things that you can account for because you've seen them happen, the programs that have been cut, at least in recent years.
Sure. So I just got involved in this in the past couple of months, and what I've learned is last year, 50 out of 125 schools began the year with a deficit. The year before, 59 out of 125 schools began the year with a deficit. Schools are having special educators cut, specialists such as science teachers, gym teachers, music, arts. Some of the comments on the petition that we began include, my school doesn't have paper. So we're seeing the cuts all over. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? There's all these tiny, tiny things, but they begin to add up.
Of course, another thing you're concerned about is a funding formula that's supposed to have, I guess, weighted decisions that correspond to some kind of student need. Explain how that works and why you think it needs to be fixed in some way.
Sure. The Opportunity Index, which is, in theory, a brilliant idea. So they track students by geocode, and students who need a little more support because of their socioeconomic status or their exposure to trauma or violence are given a score. And then the schools that those students go to are given additional funds called the Opportunity Index. Those funds go to funding partnerships to help those students. It sounds great. But where it becomes illogical is you have a school that may get, say, $128,000 in Opportunity Index funds. So they're saying you need additional support, you need additional partnerships, but we're actually going to cut your operating budget by $98,000. So you need additional support, but you don't need additional specialists in the school, or you don't need paper in the school, or you don't need a gym teacher in the school. Where their funding is great, but I feel like we need to focus on the basics first.
Of course, another factor here is you have some schools that are very popular, they're oversubscribed, and you have some other schools that deservedly are not, less attractive or less popular. How does that influence funding?
So our money follows the student. Every student gets a certain amount of money. And wherever the student goes, the money goes. But that works in a way that hurts schools, because when students register for a school, it becomes popular. More people want that school. So they stop enrolling in a school down the street. So when there's less kids enrolled, they get less money, and then it becomes a vicious cycle. So you get less money, less people want to go to your school. Then you have a smaller enrollment. And each year you get a little bit less in funding, and you have to cut more services. So it becomes a less desirable school. It's a vicious cycle.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Jane Miller from Smart BPS. Jane, talking about cycles here, one thing you could do to change the scenario you just described is you take some of the money from those popular schools, the higher achieving schools maybe, and you give it to other schools, and then the parents for that first group of schools, they get upset. I mean, can't you, is there a way to get out of that somehow?
I don't have the answers, so I wish I did. I wish it came on here and I said you do it A, B, C, and D. But I do think that I've looked at the comments from the school committee members over the past few years, and I know that they realize there's an issue too. The idea that we can't give every school some kind of base and then a per pupil addition doesn't make sense, right? So if you end up at a less popular school, you get less services. It's a lottery. You just didn't do well on the lottery, so too bad. That's just a poor way of educating people. So there has to be some way that we can give every school what they need as a base and then an additional per pupil cost depending on their population.
Of course, talk about your petition, what exactly you're aiming for.
So we looked at the budget over the past few years. Like I said, I'm new to this, I'm not a professional, but what stood out to me was that every year we got the biggest budget ever, but the actual school's budget increased by less than 1% every year. So we figured inflation is about 3%. Everybody can agree that COLA is 3%. And if we were to get 3% every year, we would have gotten a $14 million increase directly to the schools. Instead, we got less than $3 million every year. So we started a petition to ask for the difference of that $11 million over the past 3 years to be put back into the schools to restore the services that have been cut.
So when you say put back into the schools, you mean the money that was listed as going to an individual school as opposed to some kind of centralized spending?
Correct.
What about the response so far to this?
There's only been a few hundred people, which apparently from people that I've reached out to, they said that that's normal before the budget is announced. And what we would like to do is get people paying attention before February 7th when the official budget is rolled out to the school committee. And this petition has helped us do that.
Of course, another budget pattern in recent years was that the city has been getting less money from other sources, whether the state or the federal government. I think Charlie Baker might try to be fixing that a little bit this time around, but what about those outside sources?
We do need to reach out to our state reps and get some of the money back that wasn't given to us. I guess there's also money that when we put into buildings over the years we didn't get back from the state. There's the Chapter 70 money. There are other resources that we need to look into getting back from the state. And I do know that there's also a group of parents who's looking into that specifically.
We should mention if people want to keep track of your campaign, what's the best way to find that?
You can visit our Facebook page, which is Start Smart BPS, and on there the first thing you'll see is a link to the petition.
Thank you very much for being with us.